Hello, and welcome back to Early Global Cultures. I'm Professor Amy Young, and today we'll explore the Eastern successor to Rome, or the Byzantine Empire. But before we begin, and since we've been talking so much about religion lately, perhaps we should ask, what causes religious differences? I suppose it could be as simple as people have different beliefs, but when beliefs are closely related, why do they diverge? Do you guys remember this dumb dress? If you don't, then maybe look up the dress after you watch this video. What color or combination of colors do you see when you look at this dress? Do you see a white and gold dress? Do you see a black and blue dress? For an internet minute, this dress was causing all sorts of problems. When I first heard about the problems, I, like most people, looked at the image and didn't understand what the big deal was. I even brought it up at dinner one night, and the friends I was with agreed. People were going nuts for no reason. I mean, clearly, they said, the dress is white and gold, and people who are claiming it's black and blue are crazy. I was struck silent when I heard this. How could it be? How could two people that I loved and respected really think this dress was anything other than black and blue? Was there something wrong with them? After dinner, I even went so far as to research what could possibly make someone see the dress as white and gold. It bothered me that much. But what's perhaps more interesting than the reasons for the different visions, and by the way, there were plenty of people weighing in on that, was the reasons why people were getting so upset when someone saw it differently than they did. Why was I so upset? Why was I questioning everything I knew about my friends? I think the reason is this. All of my life, I've believed that I can trust what I see. And barring any sort of vision impairment, I thought I could trust that other people were seeing something similar to what I was seeing. But then that truth was tested. I questioned my friends before I questioned my own vision. And I think this could apply to religions that have the same roots or even sects within the same religion. We trust what we know, what we've been taught, and most importantly, our own experiences. And very often that means that our circumstances are the creators of our truth. So maybe, with this in mind, it's best to look at context to better understand why a slightly different belief might appeal to someone, or in some circumstances might just better suit their needs. And we'll consider that today as we look at Byzantium too. Today, in early global cultures, we'll work to understand the historical, philosophical, and political context of the Byzantine Empire, and we'll also explore Byzantine expression in the arts. In Byzantium, or the Byzantine Empire, Christianity is adopted by a formidable world power. See if you can tell where their interests are shaping the look of the religion in this era. So, before we begin, we should probably review the end of that Western Roman Empire. In the Roman context lecture, I mentioned some of the things that led to the decline of the Western Empire, and it really already started to find trouble with those first 5 dirty emperors after Augustus. But before it had even taken its last breath, the Emperor Constantine established an Eastern Roman capital in Constantinople, and eventually Constantinople became the new Rome. Now, Constantinople had some geographic advantages over Rome. One, it straddled a land route between the west and the east, so it was an ideal trading point. And it was also located on a defendable peninsula where Rome was more vulnerable to attack. Constantinople could also be supplied by agriculturally rich cities nearby, and it had a deep water port if it needed supplies shipped in. Plus, it was surrounded by rich forest and fresh water. All of these advantages helped to make it the place that remained when the rest of Rome went down the tubes, and it is the hub for what becomes the Byzantine Empire. Just as a reminder, around this time in Italy, the Western Roman Emperor Honorius had to move the capital to Ravenna for defensive purposes. Ravenna is swampy, so it's harder to sneak up on them, and it also has a better port, but despite his efforts, the Goths that are pushing into Italy at her poorly defended borders eventually move in and take over the capital. Add to this the fact that Rome has gotten so big that it needed to hire mercenaries to defend all of its territory, and some of those mercenaries are Goths. When the Goths in the Roman army are mistreated, they revolt, and this helps the Goths find a foothold. Eventually, the Emperor Romulus Augustulus abdicates the throne, turning the West over to the Goths, and after a period of messy Gothic rule, the Gothic king Theodoric comes in to rule the West. He brings an end to Gothic invasions and violence in the West, and he supports ideas that are on the rise in the empire, For example, he's converted to Christianity just like the Emperor Constantine did. The only trouble is that he was converted by Arian Christians. This will cause problems for him and the Goths later, and it also keeps the Eastern Empire from fully accepting him as legitimate ruler in the West. Here's a map of the area we're discussing today. Take a look at this. Who's in charge of what was once the Roman Empire in the West? There are a couple of Gothic kingdoms there, and maybe you also see the Franks and the Vandals. And what do you think of when you think of the word Gothic today? Does something dark and spooky pop into your head? Maybe someone emo with dyed black hair and black skinny jeans? And what about the word Vandal? Those words have negative connotations in our language today because of these people's relationship with the Romans 1,500 years ago. Isn't that crazy? The people got a bad rap for what they did to Rome, and now their names are forever associated with things that are dark and or dangerous. So it's not just history, but even language and its connotations are written by the winners. And if you look on the right side of the map, you can see what remained of the Roman Empire. Not quite as big as the Roman Empire once was, but thriving in the east is what will become the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople reached its highest point under Justinian in the mid-6th century. He was assisted by his wife, Theodora, and although she was a former sex worker, she was politically savvy and she was viewed as a strong imperial authority in her own right. Together, they set their sights on restoring the supremacy of the once great empire, and they had several strategies for doing this. First, they, like Augustus, worked to rebuild infrastructure by making sure people had resources via imperial roads, bridges, and aqueducts. Another step was to assert authoritarian governance throughout the empire. Justinian declared the emperor's will to be law, and he tolerated no insubordinates. At one point, the public turned on him, first breaking into a riot at a chariot race and then attacking the palace. Their siege lasted a week, and in addition to focusing their rage on the palace, they also burned other public buildings in Constantinople. Justinian, seeing the people turn on him, initially wanted to flee, but legend has it that Theodora said she wasn't going, famously stating, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud." With this, she convinces her husband to stay, and he and his army go after the rioters, reportedly killing as many as 30,000 of his own people. Justinian and Theodora were also Christians who took a great interest in theology. Their fervor even inspired them to shut down the last Platonic academy in the world because, to them, it was pagan. They were also generous to the church, and while in charge, they commissioned the building of over 25 churches and convents, some of them to replace buildings that had been burned in the Nika riots. And when he set his sights on the west, Justinian took his military and fought his way back to Rome, taking out anyone who stood in his way without impunity. It didn't matter that those who lived and ruled in the west were Christians. They were Arian heretics in Justinian's eyes, and this gave him license to take them down as he worked to reclaim territory on behalf of the empire. And this is what he was able to accomplish. The green on this map is what Justinian had when he started, and the yellow is the land in Italy and North Africa that he won back for the empire. Now, despite his somewhat shady tactics, Justinian did do a good job showcasing the grandeur of God and the grandeur of his empire in the arts, and one structure that helped him do this was the Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia is Greek for holy wisdom, and the holy bit was meant to glorify Christianity, while the wisdom part could be seen as an effort to point to the wisdom of Justinian and the empire. The church architecture employs many familiar techniques. It uses rounded Roman arches, the basilica style popularized by Constantine, and domes which had been well engineered since the Roman Empire built the Pantheon. But the Hagia Sophia employed new architectural techniques too. See, they wanted to put a dome over the basilica, and you may remember that the basilica style called for a rectangular space, making the dome a little harder to position. To get this accomplished, they used pendentives, which are triangular masonry constructions that disperse weight and allow them to put a circular dome up high over a rectilinear space. I like to think of them kind of like the little tables that folks put into pizza delivery boxes to keep the box from falling in on the pizza, but I'll show you what I mean here in a second. So the dome became a focal point in the church, and the dome in the Hagia Sophia is meant to draw the eye heavenward. Remember, these churches are dark, and to provide a light source, they installed 40 windows around the top of the dome. The effect kind of makes it seem like the dome is floating, about 184 feet in the air. The church became the pinnacle of architectural achievement in Justinian's era, and when the Byzantine Empire fell to the Ottoman Turks, it was converted to a mosque. Today, however, it's a museum in Istanbul. Here's a view of it from the outside. The towers, which are minarets, were added when it was converted to a mosque, but you can still see how the original structure was a striking landmark in the city. Here's the floor plan, and with this you can see how they went kind of dome crazy. They used half domes to cover the elongated nave, which is common in the basilica style, and in addition to the central windows around that dome, the church added upper windows for more light. And here's a look at the interior. The mosaics were altered or covered when it was converted to a mosque, and you can see where Arabic writings were added too. But the grandeur of that high dome with its halo of windows remains. Your eye can't help but move up to them, and that movement gives you a good look at the pendentives right here. They were added to reduce the weight of the dome and lift it higher. Oh, and don't forget the very Roman influence. There are those rounded Roman arches, and if you look closely, you can see they've used Corinthian columns in the construction too. Without a doubt, here and elsewhere in Byzantine arts, we see the marriage of Christianity and imperial interests. And another way the Byzantine Empire expressed themselves was with icons. Icons are religious figures or scenes used in worship, and their creators worked to ensure that they were not mistaken for idols. For them, the use of icons was justified because it provided believers with visual religious lessons, reaching them in ways that words alone could not, and they employed a few techniques that purportedly got them around the Second Commandment's rule against graven images. One way they did this was by making images two-dimensional and using reverse perspective. Reverse perspective removed any sense of realistic depth, so it looks like the figures are floating in space. And this, combined with the fact that they were not 3D, ensured that they were unrealistic and could not be mistaken for graven images that usurp the creative powers of God. They also played up the divinity of the figures so that people would not mistake the image for an earthly depiction. For one, the figures face forward, so we can focus on them and their lessons for us, and they're also depicted on gold backgrounds, so that we know for certain that they're holy and of the kingdom of heaven instead of our world. Well, some were painted, many more icons in this era were mosaic. Mosaics had been around for a while. They were used to create decorative, durable surfaces on walls, ceilings, and floors, and they were created using small colored tiles or stones, and sometimes even colored bits of glass called tesserae. And Ravenna, while it failed as a Roman capital, actually houses a good number of monuments that showcase mosaic icons and reflect the combination of cultures in this era. The Church of Apollinare Nuovo was a church built next to the palace of the Gothic king Theodoric. It's built in the basilica tradition, but inside it has richly ornamented mosaics in a number of styles. Here we can see where it features scenes from the Gospels at the top, images of the apostles between the windows, and it has a procession of male saints at the bottom, all of them headed to Theodoric's palace on the lower right. Just think of how many millions of tesserae went into the creation of these images that completely cover the upper level of the church's nave. And if we look closely at the windows on the image of Theodoric's palace, we can see how they tried to cover up his Arian heresy. The Arian saints that were depicted here are erased, but their hands can still be seen on some of the columns, and the shadows of their halos remain too. Another important church in Ravenna is the San Vitale, named for an early Christian martyr that died in Ravenna. It was built while Goths still ruled Ravenna, and it was built in the same year that Justinian came to the throne. As you can see, they employed rounded Roman arches and Corinthian columns, and they were also fond of mosaics. The two most interesting mosaics, though, are probably those that are on the left and the right of the altar pictured here. The mosaic on the left features the Emperor Justinian and his courtiers. How many of those icon features can you identify in this artifact? The image depicts Justinian bringing the bread for the Eucharist. On the right side of the image are some members of the clergy, and on the left side are some imperial officials. Did you notice that all of them are pretty two-dimensional? And take a look at their feet. Notice how they look like they're floating? That's that reverse perspective. Then there's the fact that the figures are facing front and the gold background representing the kingdom of heaven. But what is the lesson we're supposed to be focused on with this image? Did you notice that Justinian has a halo? That would make him a divine figure. Is that cool? Now may be a good time to note that Justinian never made it to Ravenna, and with this mosaic, the church officials were either trying to thank him or impress him. Remember, much of Byzantium's art was a combination of Christian interests and imperial interests. The fact that Justinian stands imposingly between the church and the state is a statement on his place in the empire, and the key row on the shield suggests his mission is similar to Constantine's, to be an earthly advocate for the church and for Christianity. The mosaic on the right side of the altar features the Empress Theodora and her posse bringing the chalice for the Eucharist. She, like Justinian, has a halo, as well as those other icon features like the fact that she's two-dimensional and facing front. Plus, there's reverse perspective in this work, and there's that gold background again. And she, too, has elements that show off the grandeur of the empire, as well as her ties to Christianity. The fine fabrics on Theodora and her handmaidens show off the wealth of the empire. But if we look closely at her cloak's hem, we can see an image of the three wise men. The placement of these seems to indicate that Theodora has something in common with the Virgin Mary. Now, as you might have guessed, not everyone was okay with this kind of imagery, and their opposition becomes what is called the iconoclast controversy. Iconoclast means image breaking, and it has everything to do with that second commandment. The controversy comes to a head when the Byzantine Emperor Leo III takes issue with icons. He'd been at war with Islamic forces, and he discerns that Muslims are likely winning because they're doing a better job of keeping that second commandment. When Leo outlaws icons, the Byzantine Empire starts to win battles, and Leo goes on to rule for another 25 years, so it looks like he may have been onto something by reasserting the importance of the second commandment. As others jump on the iconoclast bandwagon, many Byzantine icons are destroyed. The artworks that we see today are those that were spared, or they are icons that were created in later time periods. And despite the push to adhere to the second commandment, some folks still assert that icons are helpful, and their use is defended by iconophiles or icon lovers. Iconophiles believe that icons help Christians better understand religious lessons, and that icons offer believers a shot at visual literacy where other forms of literacy may be lacking. Eventually, this argument finds a foothold, and gradually the use of images comes back into fashion. One place that helped preserve the icon tradition was St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Desert. This monastery is one of those religious projects that was commissioned by Justinian, and it's built near the site where God is said to have appeared to Moses in the form of a burning bush. Because of its isolation and arid climate, the monastery was and is still a repository of art and culture. The monastery is surrounded by heavily fortified walls protecting it from outside attack, and inside it houses a vast collection of religious icons. In fact, not only does it contain iconography from all eras of icon painting, but monks here still create icons in the early tradition. Here's an image of the monastery. It's not much to look at, and you can see it's heavily fortified. It's built in an area that's seen more than its fair share of conflict. Interestingly, it's also said that the monastery has a letter from Muhammad stating that it's to be spared should it find itself in any jeopardy related to Muslim interests. And here's an example of the sort of icons we might find here. The Transfiguration depicts the moment that Jesus is filled with the Holy Spirit, and in this moment, according to Christian belief, he embodies the Holy Trinity, becoming a combination of God, Spirit, and Christ on earth. Once again, we can see those icon features. Jesus is facing front while the figures around him crouch and bow down in awe of what they're seeing. The gold background highlights the kingdom of heaven again, and reverse perspective ensures that the image is unrealistic. Interestingly, this image also depicts Jesus a little differently than the Western icons do. Can you spot the difference? Jesus has a beard. And being a Middle Eastern man, he would likely have had a beard, unlike how he's represented by Westerners who prefer the clean-shaven look. In addition to the iconoclast controversy, there were other issues with Christian authority and practice in the Byzantine era. The biggest one has to do with disagreements between the Western or Catholic branch of the Church and the Eastern or Orthodox branch of the Church. First, there are linguistic differences. The West speaks Latin and the East speaks Greek, and this language barrier helps flare things up when the West adds the filioque clause to the Nicene Creed. Filioque is Latin for "and from the Son," which doesn't sound like that big of a deal at first, but it has big implications for the Trinity. The addition by the West is meant to clarify that the Holy Spirit comes from the Father and from the Son, so all three figures of the Trinity are united. The East, however, says that the Spirit comes from the Father through the Son, and this is a big difference. If we think about it in terms of Venn diagrams, you can see the difference in the language. The West version demonstrates the connectedness of all three entities, but it also puts Jesus on level with God. And the East version shows the Father as the main connector, but that allows for some separateness in the figures. both sides being monotheistic, they have to be careful about their expression of the Trinity, and this language difference causes big problems. Later, they also disagree about the authority of the Pope. The West claims the Pope has ultimate authority in the Church, and the East disagrees. The way they see it, the Pope focuses on the interests of the West because the Pope has land and money there, and these political interests add to animosity. And the churches also disagree about icons. The West is the first to let go of the iconoclast controversy and starts creating religious images again. Over time, they even innovate them and make them more realistic. Think about the religious images that show up in the Renaissance. The East eventually relents too and starts making icons again in 843, but it does not innovate icon depiction. In fact, today in the East, religious art looks much like what we're seeing in today's discussion. All of this disagreement prompts the Eastern and Western churches to excommunicate each other in 1054. If you're not familiar, excommunication means you're kicked out of the church, and as such, you cannot seek forgiveness there and you cannot get to heaven with their help. Any idea when the churches finally forgave each other? The correct answer is never. They started talking again in 1965, but they remain divided today. And that is where we'll finish up the Byzantine Empire. Hopefully, you saw how imperial interests were combined with religion to send powerful messages in this era. And hopefully, you've also asked yourself some questions about whether or not these messages are good for the religion or the empire. But for now, that's all. Until next time.